A few years ago, I was rushing out of the house for an evening meeting that I had to go to, and I grabbed my truck keys, and as I did that, I realized, oh wow, I've not eaten supper yet. And it was going to be about 3 more hours before I could eat, so I grabbed an apple and just rushed out the door and went to the meeting. Round about somewhere in the second hour of whatever meeting this was, I scratched my face and went like that, and I smell an apple somewhere. And I looked around, I thought, that's rude. Like, this is not the place for somebody to be eating an apple. Who's eating an apple? And I looked around, nobody's eating an apple. I didn't see an apple anywhere. And I didn't think about it for a little while, and then started thinking again, where did that apple smell come from? And I realized it's on my hand. And then I thought, how did that get there? And I realized, oh wow, right. I ate an apple on my way here. I forgot all about that. Had very little memory of it. And it started to bother me, and I started thinking about it more. Then I realized, oh my gosh, I forgot to take that little sticker off of it too. I just gobbled the whole thing down. Now, just to head you off, this is not a sermon on mindful eating. It's a great idea. I highly recommend that you are mindful of the food that you're putting in your mouth and that you really get some pleasure out of it. But that's not what I'm talking about. I tell you that story because that was one of the moments that I realized, you know how sometimes we have these experiences in our lives that just hold up a mirror to us. Now, this is what's happening in your life. That was one of those times where I realized just how disconnected I was from the food I was eating. I could hardly remember eating that apple. I didn't even have any consideration of where that apple came from. What soil was it grown in? Who picked it? Who lost money on that apple? My guess is that I'm not alone in my ignorance. And my other guess is that there is some group of people out there who have a vested interest in me not knowing where my food comes from or my pleasure in eating it. I realized in that night of absent-minded apple eating that my relationship with food was a barometer of my spiritual well-being. That it was a window into how I was doing spiritually. Food was actually more a part of my spiritual life than I had realized. And it might be interesting for you to know that at the time I was farming. And I was growing grass-fed beef and vegetables and eggs that were nutritious and tasty and yet still disconnected. Today's reading from Exodus chapter 16, this is one of those rich texts in the scripture that we revisit throughout the year, and it's worth hours of study. And we'll have that opportunity later in the fall. I hope to field a adult formation offering this fall, beginning this fall, on agrarian readings of scripture, and this will be one of those texts that we explore. But you know the general story. The Israelites leave Egypt, where they were enslaved. And in Egypt, they were agricultural workers. They were also agricultural builders. So they worked in the fields, but they also were building these granaries, these large granary cities for Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh would collect over 50% of all the grain grown in his domain. Ancient Egypt was very much like modern industrial agriculture, except instead of consuming fossil fuels, they consumed human lives to mass produce food and to consolidate wealth. Under Moses' leadership, they come out of Egypt, and they don't really know where they're going. They have this vague idea of some land out there that they're going to be moving towards, but that's not in focus. They haven't done any recon on it. They don't know really what's happening, but they just know that where they're going is on the other side of a vast wilderness. And that's where we get to in chapter 16 of the book of Exodus. 3 weeks into their trip, few weeks into their trip, guess what? They run out of food. And so they start to grumble against Moses. They start saying, hey, why did you lead us out here? Then they start thinking that Moses led them out in the wilderness so that God could kill them, just like God killed all of those Egyptians. They were hungry. They wanted to be fed. And then they start to look back to Egypt. Oh boy, we had it good in Egypt. Remember those flesh pots we used to sit by and eat our bread there? Which, if you really read deeply into that text, they weren't eating out of the flesh pots. They were eating the bread next to them, because the enslaved people rarely ate the meat. That was for other people. But in their imaginations, looking back, the ways of Egypt were very, very attractive. The people in this story, they're at a pivot point. They're at a pivot point in their history, in their way of being together, in order to enter into that promised land. And that promised land is a place for them eventually. But it's also a new way of being together. For them to enter into a new way of being together as a people, in relationship with one another, in relationship with God, in relationship with the land, they have got to leave Egypt behind. They cannot build their future on the destructive forms of the past. There's a great temptation for them, and you hear it in this passage, to imitate the ways of Egypt. This new way of being in community was not just sociologically necessary, it was spiritually essential. Walking out of Egypt was one thing. Getting Egypt out of your head, that's a whole other deal. Food was critical to their liberation. They ate that Passover meal, remember? That night that they left, they ate the Passover meal. Then they have this manna in the wilderness. And their first experience of this place they're going, this promised land, their first experience of that is going to be the food that they eat from it. Their experience of God is shaped by their relationship with the food that they eat. This story was written centuries after the events that it supposedly recounts. Who knows what happened? But this story gets told and retold within the community, and then it eventually gets written down, not because it is some kind of historically accurate tale, but because it teaches spiritual truths. And in this story that they told one another, God rains down this flour-like substance every night. And then people go out in the morning and they gather it up. They called it manna from the Hebrew, what is it? What is this stuff? And that was its name, manna. God teaches the people in this with this manna, teaches them new, what we might call food ways. You go out in the morning and you collect it. When you go out in the morning and you collect enough for that day only. Not just enough for that day only, but only enough for your household. And then on the sixth day of the week, on Friday, you go out and you pick up a double portion of it, because you're not going to do this work on Sunday or on the Sabbath. I'm not going to work and provide it for you on the Sabbath, nor do you have to go out and collect it on the Sabbath. What God's doing here is teaching them a new way of being in relationship with God through their food. Giving them a new way of seeing the world around them through their relationship with their food. By not gathering more than is necessary for any one day, they're experiencing this theological truth. They are experiencing this quality of creation that there is enough for everybody. If you go out every day, if everybody goes out every day and gets enough manna, over time, they're going to realize there's enough. There is enough for everybody. And they're going to start thinking in theological terms of abundance. That's what those Genesis stories are about, that there is an abundance to creation. And they're coming out of a mindset of slavery in which there is scarcity. And over time, this practice of daily gathering, there's enough for everybody, is going to teach them that the creation is abundant. And when people have that kind of perspective in their communities, boy, things start to change. When people are driven by scarcity, there's fear, there's competition, there's all kinds of difficulty. But when there's abundance, when there is enough for everybody, totally changes the relationships within the community. The people's practice around food also shaped their understanding of justice and equity. No one was allowed to control the production of this food. God was producing the food. That was an important lesson. But nobody could get more than they needed. Nobody could consolidate the food supply and get power over others. There will be no entrepreneur getting up early in the morning and going out and scraping up all the manna and then coming back into the camp and selling it back to the people for a profit. That wasn't going to happen. Egyptian pharaohs controlled people by controlling the food supply. They used that consolidated wealth to lord it over people, and Yahweh says no. No one in this community is going to gain that kind of resource power over other people. When the power of food production gets into the hands of a few, always the earth pays a price. And also it damages and undermines equality within a community. The ancient Israelites learned about democratic living, about the equality of living together through their experience of food. Our practices around food shape our spiritual lives. It's true for the ancient Israelites, it's true for us. Production, distribution, cooking, and eating of food is a spiritual practice. We see this story in Scripture from Exodus chapter 16, but we see it throughout Scripture. Remember in those Genesis stories, humans actually grow up out of this soil just like the rest of the plants that we eat. There's this troubled relationship in the garden. Humankind gets cast out of it. There's the Passover meal, the manna, the feeding of the 5,000, these early Christian meals, common meals. There's the Eucharist. Food is a fundamental spiritual practice. It's not a metaphor. It's not a prop. It is a character throughout Scripture in the story itself. Our relationship with food is also a barometer of our own spiritual well-being. It's true as individuals, it's true of us as a society as a whole. One person has written that eating is an agricultural act. It's also a spiritual act. Because eating connects us with the earth. We don't have to think about it long. We are literally taking the earth into our bodies. And when we get connected to the earth, again, back to those ancient myths, we are connecting with the divine presence. It also connects us with one another because I can grow a lot of food for myself, but I can't grow all of it. I need your help. We have to help to feed one another. It connects us to each other. Eating is loaded with ethical and economic implications. In a newsletter a couple of weeks ago, I extended an invitation to all of you to join with me in cooking locally sourced food for college and high school students on Sunday evenings. That ministry is rooted in this theology, in this fundamental Christian understanding that growing, sharing, and eating food together is a spiritual practice. It's also a rebellion against Egypt, against the powers that have controlled food for way too long and would have us be disconnected from our food, from one another, from the earth. Going out there and gathering up the manna day after day, just enough for today, sometimes enough for tomorrow too. That might not seem like much. It might not seem like some big sweeping policy change that's going to turn it all upside down and make it right. But you do that long enough, and it's going to change you. You go out there and you gather up that manna day after day, you do that long enough together, it's going to change your community. You do it long enough, it's going to heal the earth.